What the Buddha Taught by Walpola Rahula. Chapter 6. The Doctrine of No Soul, Anatta. What in general is suggested by soul, self, ego, or to use the Sanskrit expression, Atman, is that in man there is a permanent, everlasting, and absolute entity, which is the unchanging substance behind the changing phenomenal world. According to some religions, each individual has such a separate soul which is created by God, and which, finally after death, lives eternally either in heaven or hell, its destiny depending on the judgment of its creator. According to others, it goes through many lives till it is completely purified and becomes finally united with God, or Brahman, universal soul, or Atman, from which it originally emanated. This soul or self in man is the thinker of thoughts, feeler of sensations, and receiver of rewards and punishments for all its actions, good and bad. Such a conception is called the idea of self. Buddhism stands unique in the history of human thought in denying the existence of such a soul, self, or Atman. According to the teaching of the Buddha, the idea of self is an imaginary, false belief which has no corresponding reality, and it produces harmful thoughts of me and mine, selfish desire, craving, attachment, hatred, ill will, conceit, pride, egoism, and other defilements, impurities, and problems. It is the source of all the troubles in the world, from personal conflicts to wars between nations. In short, to this false view can be traced all the evil in the world. Two ideas are psychologically deep-rooted in man: self-protection and self-preservation. For self-protection, man has created God, on whom he depends for his own security, safety, and protection, just as a child depends on its parent. For self-preservation, man has conceived the idea of an immortal soul, or Atman, which will live eternally. In his ignorance, weakness, fear, and desire, man needs these two things to console himself. Hence he clings to them deeply and fanatically. The Buddha's teaching does not support this ignorance, weakness, fear, and desire, but aims at making man enlightened by removing and destroying them, striking at their very root. According to Buddhism, our ideas of God and soul are false and empty. Though highly developed as theories, they are all the same extremely subtle mental projections, garbed in an intricate metaphysical and philosophical phraseology. These ideas are so deeply rooted in man, and so near and dear to him, that he does not wish to hear, nor does he want to understand, any teaching against them. The Buddha knew this quite well. In fact, he said that his teaching was against the current, btih, against man's selfish desires. Just 4 weeks after his enlightenment, seated under a banyan tree, he thought to himself, "I have realized this truth which is deep, difficult to see, difficult to understand, comprehensible only by the wise. Men who are overpowered by passions and surrounded by a mass of darkness cannot see this truth, which is against the current, which is lofty, deep, subtle, and hard to comprehend." With these thoughts in his mind, the Buddha hesitated for a moment, whether it would not be in vain if he tried to explain to the world the truth he had just realized. Then he compared the world to a lotus pond. In a lotus pond, there are some lotuses still under water. There are others which have risen up only to the water level. There are still others which stand above water and are untouched by it. In the same way in this world, there are men at different levels of development. some would understand the truth. So the Buddha decided to teach it. The doctrine of anatta, or no soul, is the natural result of, or the corollary to, the analysis of the five aggregates and the teaching of conditioned genesis, paticca samuppada. We have seen earlier in the discussion of the first noble truth, dukkha, that what we call a being or an individual is composed of the five aggregates, and that when these are analyzed and examined, there is nothing behind them which can be taken as I, Atman, or self, or any unchanging, abiding substance. That is the analytical method. The same result is arrived at through the doctrine of conditioned genesis, which is the synthetical method. And according to this, nothing in the world is absolute. Everything is conditioned, relative, and interdependent. This is the Buddhist theory of relativity. Before we go into the question of anatta proper, it is useful to have a brief idea of the conditioned genesis. The principle of this doctrine is given in a short formula of 4 lines. When this is, that is. Imasmim sati idam hoti. This arising, that arises. Imasupada idam upajati. When this is not, that is not. Imasmim asati idam nahoti. This ceasing, that ceases. Imasa nirodha idam nirujati. Footnote. To put it into a modern form, when A is, B is. A arising, B arises. When A is not, B is not. A ceasing, B ceases. End of footnote. On this principle of conditionality, relativity, and interdependence, the whole existence and continuity of life and its cessation are explained in a detailed formula, which is called paticca samuppada, conditioned genesis, consisting of 12 factors. 1. Through ignorance are conditioned volitional actions or karma formations, avijja pachaya samkara. Through volitional actions is conditioned consciousness, samkara pachaya vijnanam. Through consciousness are conditioned mental and physical phenomena, vijnana pachaya namarupam. Through mental and physical phenomena are conditioned the 6 faculties, i.e., 5 physical sense organs and mind. Namarupa pachaya salayatanam. 5. Through the 6 faculties is conditioned sensorial and mental contact, salayatana pachaya phaso. 6. Through sensorial and mental contact is conditioned sensation, phasa pachaya vedana. 7. Through sensation is conditioned desire, thirst, vedana pachaya tanha. 8. Through desire, thirst, is conditioned clinging, tanha pachaya upadanam. 9. Through clinging is conditioned the process of becoming, upadana pachaya bhavo. 10. Through the process of becoming is conditioned birth, bhava pachaya jati. 11. Through birth are conditioned 12. Decay, death, lamentation, pain, etc. Jati pachaya Jamaramamam. This is how life arises, exists, and continues. If we take this formula in reverse order, we come to the cessation of the process. Through the complete cessation of ignorance, volitional activities, or karma formations cease. Through the cessation of volitional activities, consciousness ceases. Through the cessation of birth, decay, death, sorrow, etc., cease. It should be remembered that each of these factors is conditioned, paticca as well as conditioning, paticca. Therefore, they are all relative, interdependent, and interconnected, and nothing is absolute or independent. Hence, no first cause is accepted by Buddhism, as we have seen earlier. Conditioned genesis should be considered a circle, and not as a chain. The question of free will has occupied an important place in Western thought and philosophy. But according to conditioned genesis, this question does not and cannot arise in Buddhist philosophy. If the whole of existence is relative, conditioned, and interdependent, how can will alone be free? Will, which is included in the fourth aggregate, samkhara khandha, like any other thought, is conditioned, paticca. So-called freedom itself in this world is not absolutely free. That too is conditioned and relative. There is, of course, such a conditioned and relative free will, but not unconditioned and absolute. There can be nothing absolutely free in this world, physical or mental, as everything is conditioned and relative. If free will implies a will independent of conditions, independent of cause and effect, such a thing does not exist. How can a will, or anything for that matter, arise without conditions, away from cause and effect, when the whole of life, the whole of existence, is conditioned and relative? Here again, the idea of free will is basically connected with the ideas of God, soul, justice, reward, and punishment. Not only so-called free will is not free, but even the very idea of free will is not free from conditions. According to the doctrine of conditioned genesis, as well as according to the analysis of being into 5 aggregates, the idea of an abiding, immortal substance in man or outside, whether it is called Atman, I, soul, self, or ego, is considered only a false belief, a mental projection. This is the Buddhist doctrine of Anatta, no soul or no self. In order to avoid a confusion, it should be mentioned here that there are 2 kinds of truths: conventional truth, samothisacca, and ultimate truth, paramattasacca. When we use such expressions in our daily life as I, you, being, individual, etc., we do not lie because there is no self or being as such, but we speak a truth conforming to the convention of the world. But the ultimate truth is that there is no I or being in reality. As the Mahayana Sutralankara says, a person, Pudgala, should be mentioned as existing only in designation, prajnapti, i.e., conventionally there is a being, but not in reality or substance. Quote, the negation of an imperishable Atman is the common characteristic of all dogmatic systems of the lesser as well as the great vehicle, and there is, therefore, no reason to assume that Buddhist tradition, which is in complete agreement on this point, has deviated from the Buddha's original teaching. H. von Glasenapp, in an article Vedanta and Buddhism on the question of Anatta. End footnote. An end of quote. It is therefore curious that recently there should have been a vain attempt by a few scholars to smuggle the idea of self into the teaching of the Buddha, quite contrary to the spirit of Buddhism. Footnote. The late Mrs. Rice Davids and others. See Mrs. Rice Davids' Gautama the Man, Shakya or Buddhist Origins, A Manual of Buddhism, What Was the Original Buddhism, etc. End of footnote. These scholars respect, admire, and venerate the Buddha and his teaching. They look up to Buddhism. But they cannot imagine that the Buddha, whom they consider the most clear and profound thinker, could have denied the existence of an Atman, or self, which they need so much. They unconsciously seek the support of the Buddha for this need for eternal existence. Of course not in a petty individual self with a small s, but in the big self with a capital S. It is better to say frankly that one believes in an Atman or self. Or one may even say that the Buddha was totally wrong in denying the existence of an Atman. But certainly it will not do for anyone to try to introduce into Buddhism an idea which the Buddha never accepted, as far as we can see from the extant original texts. Religions which believe in God and soul make no secret of these two ideas. On the contrary, they proclaim them, constantly and repeatedly, in the most eloquent terms. If the Buddha had accepted these two ideas, so important in all religions, he certainly would have declared them publicly, as he had spoken about other things, and would not have left them hidden to be discovered only 25 centuries after his death. People become nervous at the idea that through the Buddha's teachings of anatta, the self they imagine they have is going to be destroyed. The Buddha was not unaware of this. A bhikkhu once asked him, "Sir, is there a case where one is tormented when something permanent within oneself is not found?" "Yes, bhikkhu, there is," answered the Buddha. Quote, "A man has the following view. The universe is that Atman. I shall be that after death, permanent, abiding, everlasting, unchanging, and I shall exist as such for eternity. He hears the Tathagata or a disciple of his preaching the doctrine aiming at the complete destruction of all speculative views, aiming at the extinction of thirst, aiming at detachment, cessation, nirvana. Then that man thinks, I will be annihilated, I will be destroyed, I will be no more. So he mourns, worries himself, laments, weeps, beating his breast, and becomes bewildered. Thus, O bhikkhu, there is a case where one is tormented when something permanent within oneself is not found." End quote. Elsewhere, the Buddha says, "O bhikkhus, this idea that I may not be, I may not have, is frightening to the uninstructed worldling." Those who want to find a self in Buddhism argue as follows. It is true that the Buddha analyzes being into matter, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, and says that none of these things is self. But he does not say that there is no self at all in man or anywhere else, apart from these aggregates. This position is untenable for two reasons. One is that, according to the Buddha's teaching, a being is composed only of these 5 aggregates, and nothing more. Nowhere has he said that there was anything more than these 5 aggregates in a being. The second reason is that the Buddha denied categorically, in unequivocal terms, in more than one place, the existence of Atman, soul, self, or ego within man or without, or anywhere else in the universe. Let us take some examples. In the Dhammapada, there are 3 verses extremely important and essential in the Buddha's teaching. They are numbers 5, 6, and 7 of chapters 20, or verses 277, 78, and 79. The first 2 verses say, all conditioned things are impermanent, sabba samkara anicca, and all conditioned things are dukkha, sabba samkara dukkha. The third verse says, all dhammas are without self, sabbe dhamma anatta. Here it should be carefully observed that in the first 2 verses the word samkara, conditioned things, is used. But in its place in the third verse the word dhamma is used. Why didn't the third verse use the word samkara, conditioned things, as the previous 2 verses? And why did it use the term dhamma instead? Here lies the crux of the whole matter. The term samkara denotes the 5 aggregates, all conditioned, interdependent, relative things and states, both physical and mental. If the third verse has said all samkara, conditioned things, are without self, then one might think that although conditioned things are without self, yet there may be a self outside conditioned things, outside of the 5 aggregates. It is in order to avoid misunderstanding that the term Dhamma is used in the third verse. The term Dhamma is much wider than Samkara. There is no term in Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist terminology wider than Dhamma. It includes not only the conditioned things and states, but also the non-conditioned, the absolute, nirvana. There is nothing in the universe or outside, good or bad, conditioned or non-conditioned, relative or absolute, which is not included in this term. Therefore, it is quite clear, according to this statement, all dhammas are without self. There is no self, no Atman, not only in the 5 aggregates, but nowhere else too outside them or apart from them. This means, according to the Theravada teaching, that there is no self either in the individual, Pugala, or in the Dhammas. The Mahayana Buddhist philosophy maintains exactly the same position, without the slightest difference, on this point, putting emphasis on Dharma Nairamta, as well as Pugdala Nairatmya. In the Alagadupama Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, addressing his disciples, the Buddha said, O bhikkhus, accept a soul theory, Attavada, in the acceptance of which there would not arise grief, lamentation, suffering, distress, and tribulation. But do you see, O bhikkhus, such a soul theory in the acceptance of which there would not arise grief, lamentation, suffering, distress, and tribulation? Certainly not, sir. He replies, Good, O bhikkhus. I too, O bhikkhus, do not see a soul theory in acceptance of which there would not arise grief, lamentation, suffering, distress, and tribulation. If there had been any soul theory which the Buddha had accepted, he would certainly have explained it here. because he asked the bhikkhus to accept that soul theory which did not produce suffering. But in the Buddha's view, there is no such soul theory, and any soul theory, whatever it may be, however subtle and sublime, is false and imaginary, creating all kinds of problems, producing in its train grief, lamentation, suffering, distress, tribulation, and trouble. Continuing the discourse, the Buddha said in the same sutta, O bhikkhus, when neither self nor anything pertaining to self can truly and really be found, this speculative view, the universe is that Atman, soul, I shall be that after death, permanent, abiding, everlasting, unchanging, and I shall exist as such for eternity. Is it not wholly and completely foolish? Footnote. Referring to this passage, S. Radhakrishnan, Indian philosophy, says, quote, it is the false view that clamors for the perpetual continuance of the small self that the Buddha refutes. End quote. We cannot agree with this remark. On the contrary, the Buddha in fact here refutes the universal term, Atman or soul. As we saw just now in the earlier passage, the Buddha did not accept any self, great or small. In his view, all theories of Atman were false, mental projections. End footnote. Here the Buddha explicitly states that an Atman, or soul, or self, is nowhere to be found in reality, and it is foolish to believe that there is such a thing. Those who seek a self in the Buddha's teaching quote a few examples which they first translate wrongly and then misinterpret. One of them is the well-known line, btih atano natto, from the Dhammapada, or verse 160, which is translated as, self is the lord of self, and then interpreted to mean that the big self is the lord of the small self. First of all, this translation is incorrect. Atta here does not mean self in the sense of a soul. In Pali, the word atta is generally used as a reflexive or indefinite pronoun, except in a few cases where it specifically and philosophically refers to the soul theory, as we have seen above. But in general usage, as in the chapter 7 in the Dhammapada where this line occurs, and in many other places, it is used as a reflexive or indefinite pronoun, meaning myself, yourself, himself, oneself, etc. Footnote. In his article Vedanta and Buddhism, H. von Glasenapp explains this point clearly. End footnote. Next, the word natho does not mean lord, but refuge, support, help, protection. Footnote. The commentary on the Dhammapada says, Natto ti patita. Natto means support, refuge, help, protection. The old Sinhalese Sanaya of the Dhammapada paraphrases the word natto as pihiti vaneya, is a support, refuge, help. If we take the negative form of natto, this means becomes further confirmed. Anatta does not mean without a lord or lordless, but it means helpless, supportless, unprotected, poor. Even the PTS Pali Dictionary explains the word natha as protector, refuge, help, but not as lord. The translation of the word Lokanatta by Savior of the World, just using a popular Christian expression, is not quite correct, because the Buddha is not a savior. This epithet really means refuge of the world. End of footnote. Therefore, atta hi atano nato really means one is one's own refuge, or one is one's own help or support. It has nothing to do with any metaphysical soul or self. It simply means that you have to rely on yourself and not rely on others. Another example of the attempt to introduce the idea of self into the Buddha's teaching is in the well-known words Attadipa, Viharata, Attasarana, Ananyasarana, which are taken out of context in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. This phrase literally means dwell making yourselves your island, support, making yourselves your refuge, and not anyone else as your refuge. Footnote. Rice Davids. Be ye lamps unto yourself. Be ye a refuge to yourselves. Betake yourselves to no external refuge, as an alternate translation. End footnote. Those who wish to see a self in Buddhism interpret the words Attadipa and Attasarana, taking self as a lamp, taking self as a refuge. Footnote 3. Dipa here does not mean lamp, but it definitely means island. The Digha Nikaya commentary, commenting on the word Dipa, here says, Mahasamuda Gatam Dipam via Atanam Dipam Patitam Katva Viharatha. Dwell making yourselves an island, a support, resting place, even as an island in the great ocean. Samsara, the continuity of existence, is usually compared to an ocean. Samsara Sagara, and what is required in the ocean for safety, is an island, a solid land, not a lamp. End of footnote. We cannot understand the full meaning and significance of the advice of the Buddha to Ananda unless we take into consideration the background and the context in which these words were spoken. The Buddha was at the time staying at a village called Beluva. It was just 3 months before his death, parinirvana. At this time he was 80 years old and was suffering from a very serious illness, almost dying, maranantika. But he thought it was not proper for him to die without breaking it to his disciples who were near and dear to him. So with courage and determination he bore all his pains, got the better of his illness, and recovered. But his health was still poor. After his recovery, he was seated one day in the shade outside his residence. Ananda, the most devoted attendant of the Buddha, went to his beloved master, sat near him, and said, Sir, I have looked after the health of the Blessed One. I have looked after him in his illness. But at the sight of the illness of the Blessed One, the horizon became dim to me, and my faculties were no longer clear. Yet there was one little consolation. I thought that the Blessed One would not pass away until he had left instructions touching the order of the Sangha. End quote. Then the Buddha, full of compassion and human feeling, gently spoke to his devoted and beloved attendant. Quote, Ananda, what does the order of the Sangha expect from me? I have taught the Dhamma, truth, without making any distinction as exoteric and esoteric. With regard to the truth, the Tathagata has nothing like the closed fist of a teacher, Akariyamuti. Surely, Ananda, if there is anyone who thinks that he will lead the Sangha, and that the Sangha should depend on him, let him set down his instructions. But the Tathagata had no such idea. Why should he then leave instructions concerning the Sangha? I am now old, Ananda, 80 years old. As a worn-out cart has to be kept going by repairs, so, it seems to me, the body of the Tathagata can only be kept going by repairs. Therefore, Ananda, dwell making yourselves your island, support, making yourselves, not anyone else, your refuge, making the Dhamma your island, support, the Dhamma your refuge, nothing else your refuge. End quote. What the Buddha wanted to convey to Ananda is quite clear. The latter was sad and depressed. He thought they would all be lonely, helpless, without a refuge, without a leader after their great teacher's death. So the Buddha gave him consolation, courage, and confidence, saying that they should depend on themselves and on the Dhamma he taught, and not on anyone else or on anything else. Here the question of a metaphysical Atman, or self, is quite beside the point. Further, the Buddha explained to Ananda how one could be one's own island or refuge, how one could make the Dhamma one's own island or refuge, through the cultivation of mindfulness or awareness of the body, sensations, mind and mind objects, the 4 Satipatthanas. There is no talk at all here about an Atman or self. Another reference, oft-quoted, is used by those who try to find Atman in the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha was once seated under a tree in a forest on the way from Uruvela from Benares. On that day, 30 friends, all of them young princes, went out on a picnic with their young wives into the same forest. One of the princes, who was unmarried, brought a prostitute with him. While the others were amusing themselves, she purloined some objects of value and disappeared. In their search for her in the forest, they saw the Buddha seated under a tree and asked him whether he had seen a woman. He inquired what was the matter. When they explained, the Buddha asked them, "What do you think, young men? Which is better for you, to search after a woman or to search after yourselves?" Here again, it is a simple and natural question, and there is no justification for introducing far-fetched ideas of metaphysical Atman or self into the business. They answered that it was better for them to search after themselves. The Buddha then asked them to sit down and explain the Dhamma to them. In the available account, in the original text of what he preached to them, not a word is mentioned about an Atman. Much has been written on the subject of the Buddha's silence when a certain parivrajaka, wanderer, named Vakagota, asked him whether there was an Atman or not. The story is as follows. Vakagota comes to the Buddha and asks, "Venerable Gautama, is there an Atman?" The Buddha is silent. "Then, Venerable Gautama, is there no Atman?" Again the Buddha is silent. Vakagota gets up and walks away. After the parivrajaka had left, Ananda asked the Buddha why he did not answer Vakagota's question. The Buddha explains his position. Ananda, when asked by Vakagota the wanderer, "Is there a self?" If I had answered, "There is a self," then, Ananda, that would be siding with those recluses and brahmanas who hold the eternalist theory, Sasatavada. And, Ananda, when asked by the wanderer, "Is there no self?" if I had answered, "There is no self," then that would be siding with those recluses and brahmanas who hold the annihilationist theory. Ukeda Vada. Footnote. On another occasion, the Buddha had told this same Vakagota that the Tathagata had no theories because he had seen the nature of things. Here, too, he does not want to associate himself with any theorists. End footnote. Again, Ananda, when asked by Vakagota, "Is there a self?" if I had answered, "There is a self," would that be in accordance with my knowledge that all dhammas are without self? He replies, "Surely not, sir." The Buddha replies, "And again, Ananda, when asked by the wanderer, 'Is there no self?' if I had answered, 'There is no self,' then that would have been a greater confusion to the already confused Vakagota." Two footnotes. In fact, on another occasion, evidently earlier, when the Buddha had explained a certain deep and subtle question, the question as to what happened to an arahant after death, Vakagota said, "Venerable Gautama, here I fall into ignorance. I get into confusion. Whatever little faith I had at the beginning of this conversation with the Venerable Gautama, that too is gone now." So the Buddha did not want to confuse him again. Earlier footnote on the question of all dhammas are without self. Exactly the same words as in the first line of the Dhammapada 20. Woodward's translation of these words by "all things are impermanent" is completely wrong, probably due to an oversight, but this is a very serious mistake. This perhaps is one of the reasons for so much unnecessary talk on the Buddha's silence. The most important word in this context, anatta, without a self, has been translated as impermanent. The English translations of Pali texts contain major and minor errors of this kind, some due to carelessness or oversight, some to lack of proficiency in the original language. Whatever the cause may be, it is useful to mention here, with the deference due to those great pioneers in this field, that these errors have been responsible for a number of wrong ideas about Buddhism among people who have no access to the original texts. It is good to know, therefore, that Miss I. B. Horner, the secretary of the Pali Text Society, plans to bring out revised and new translations. End of footnote. For Vakagota would have thought, "Formerly, indeed, I had an Atman, but now I haven't got one." It should now be quite clear why the Buddha was silent. But it would be still clearer if we take into consideration the whole background and the way the Buddha treated questions and questioners, which is altogether ignored by those who have discussed this problem. The Buddha was not a computing machine giving answers to whatever questions were put to him by anyone at all, without any consideration. He was a practical teacher, full of compassion and wisdom. He did not answer questions to show his knowledge and intelligence, but to help the questioner on the way to realization. He always spoke to people bearing in mind their standard of development, their tendencies, their mental makeup, their character, their capacity to understand a particular question. According to the Buddha, there are 4 ways of treating questions. 1. Some should be answered directly. 2. Others should be answered by way of analyzing them. 3. Yet others should be answered by counter questions. And 4. And lastly, there are questions which should be put aside. There may be several ways of putting aside a question. One is to say that a particular question is not answered or explained, as the Buddha had told this very same Vakagota on more than one occasion, when those famous questions on whether the universe is eternal or not, etc., were put to him. In the same way he had replied to Malunkyaputta and others. But he could not say the same thing with regard to the question whether there is an Atman, self, or not, because he had always discussed and explained it. He could not say there is self, because it is contrary to his knowledge that all Dhammas are without self. Then he did not want to say there is no self, because that would unnecessarily, without any purpose, have confused and disturbed poor Vakagota, who was already confused on a similar question, as he had himself admitted earlier. He was not yet in a position to understand the idea of anatta. Therefore, to put aside this question by silence was the wisest thing in this particular case. We must not forget, too, that the Buddha had known Vakagota quite well for a long time. This was not the first occasion on which this inquiring wanderer had come to see him. The wise and compassionate teacher gave much thought and showed great consideration for this confused seeker. There are many references in the Pali texts to this same Vakagota, the wanderer. His going round quite often to see the Buddha and his disciples, and putting the same kind of question again and again, evidently very much worried, almost as obsessed by these problems. The Buddha's silence seems to have had much more effect on Vakagota than any eloquent answer or discussion. Footnote. For we see that after some time Vakagota came again to see the Buddha, but this time did not ask any questions as usual, but said, "It is long since I had a talk with the Venerable Gautama. It would be good if the Venerable Gautama would preach to me on good and bad, kusala kusalam, in brief." The Buddha said that he would explain to him good and bad, in brief as well as in detail, and so he did. Ultimately, Vakagota became a disciple of the Buddha, and following his teaching, attained arahantship, realized truth, nirvana, and the problems of Atman and other questions obsessed him no more. End footnote. Some people take self to mean what is generally known as mind or consciousness. But the Buddha said that it is better for a man to take his physical body as self rather than mind, thought, or consciousness, because the former seems to be more solid than the latter. Because mind, thought, or consciousness, sita, mano, vijnana, changes constantly, day and night, even faster than the body, kaya. It is the vague feeling, I am, that creates the idea of self, which has no corresponding reality. And to see this truth is to realize nirvana, which is not very easy. In the Samyutta Nikaya, there is an enlightening conversation on this point between a bhikkhu named Khemaka and a group of bhikkhus. These bhikkhus ask Khemaka whether he sees in the five aggregates any self or anything pertaining to a self. Khemaka replies, no. Then the bhikkhus say that, if so, he should be an arahant free from all impurities. But Khemaka confesses that though he does not find in the five aggregates a self, or anything pertaining to a self, quote, I am not an arahant free from all impurities. O friends, with regard to the five aggregates of attachment, I have a feeling, I am, but I do not clearly see this is I am. End quote. Then Khemaka explains that what he calls I am is neither matter, sensation, perception, mental formations, nor consciousness, nor anything without them. But he has the feeling I am with regard to the five aggregates, though he could not see clearly this is I am. He says it is like the smell of a flower. It is neither the smell of the petals, nor of the color, nor of the pollen, but the smell of the flower. Khemaka further explains that even a person who has attained the early stages of realization still retains this feeling, I am. But later on, when he progresses further, this feeling of I am altogether disappears, just as the chemical smell of a freshly washed cloth disappears after a time when it is kept in a box. This discussion was so useful and enlightening to them that at the end of it, the text says all of them, including Khemaka himself, became arahants free from all impurities, thus finally getting rid of I am. According to the Buddha's teaching, it is as wrong to hold the opinion, I have no self, which is the annihilationist theory, as to hold the opinion, I have self, which is the eternalist theory, because both are fetters, both arising out of the false idea, I am. The correct position with regard to the question of anatta is not to take hold of any opinions or views, but to see things objectively as they are without mental projections. To see what we call I, or being, is only a combination of physical and mental aggregates, which are working together interdependently in a flux of momentary change within the law of cause and effect, and that there is nothing permanent, everlasting, unchanging, and eternal in the whole of existence. Here naturally a question arises. If there is no Atman or self, who gets the results of karma, actions? No one can answer this question better than the Buddha himself. When this question was raised by a bhikkhu, the Buddha said, I have taught you, O bhikkhus, to see conditionality everywhere in all things. The Buddha's teaching on anatta, no soul or no self, should not be considered as negative or nihilistic. Like nirvana, it is truth, reality, and reality cannot be negative. It is the false belief in a non-existing imaginary self that is negative. The teaching on anatta dispels the darkness of false beliefs and produces the light of wisdom. It is not negative. As Asanga very aptly says, there is the fact of no selfness. Nairatmyastita. End of chapter 6.